The Men Who Built the Invisible Empire, 1865 to 1893. On the day the Civil War ended, most Americans believed the fighting was over. They were wrong. The cannons stopped in April 1865. The uniforms were folded. The generals posed for portraits. But beneath the celebrations, another war began. Quieter, more calculated, and far more permanent. It was a war for control, not of land, but of the future. In a smoke-filled office in Lower Manhattan in 1866, three men sat around a walnut table lit by oil lamps. None of them were presidents. None wore military medals. Yet within 30 years, they would influence more American lives than any battlefield commander ever had. Their names rarely appeared in textbooks, but their fingerprints were everywhere. One of them was Elias Thornton Hale, a former Union supply officer turned railroad investor. He had never fired a heroic shot. He had never delivered a famous speech. What he understood instead was logistics. And logistics, he believed, won wars long before soldiers arrived. The Civil War had proven something profound. Whoever controlled transportation controlled survival. Railroads had moved troops faster than horses ever could. Telegraph wires had carried orders faster than riders. Steel and industry had crushed agriculture and tradition. Hale saw the future clearly. America would not be conquered by foreign armies. It would be shaped by infrastructure. Between 1869 and 1890, the United States laid more than 160,000 miles of railroad track. Towns rose and fell based on proximity to lines. Entire economies lived or died based on routing decisions made in rooms the public never saw. Hale became one of the quiet men who advised investors where tracks should go. Maps became weapons. A line drawn slightly north could bankrupt a farming community. A station placed 3 miles east could turn a wilderness into a city. And no one voted on those decisions. By 1873, America experienced its first massive industrial panic. Banks collapsed, workers starved, railroads failed. But while the public saw chaos, Hale saw consolidation. The weak lines died, the strong absorbed them. Control became centralized. During the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, when workers protested wage cuts across multiple states, federal troops were deployed against American laborers for the first time in peacetime. History remembers it as unrest. Hale remembered it as a test. The government had chosen industry. That choice would echo for a century. By the 1880s, America's Gilded Age glittered. Steel magnates, oil barons, and banking dynasties reshaped the economy. But behind the famous names were quiet strategists, lawyers, surveyors, planners, who understood something simple. Laws could be written, but systems could be engineered. In 1886, as the Statue of Liberty rose in New York Harbor, promising freedom to millions, Chinese laborers in the West faced exclusion laws barring them from citizenship. The contradiction was not accidental. It was structural. Hale advised on freight corridors that bypassed immigrant neighborhoods, not out of hatred, out of efficiency. Efficiency, he believed, was neutral. But neutrality, in practice, favored the powerful. By 1890, the American frontier was declared closed. The census confirmed it. There was no more empty land. Expansion would no longer be westward. It would be outward. Industrial leaders began looking beyond borders, toward Hawaii, toward Cuba, toward the Philippines. America had never called itself an empire, but it was beginning to act like one. Hale grew older watching steel replace wood, oil replace whale blubber, corporations replace small shops. He began to understand something unsettling. The men who shaped America were not those who shouted in Congress. They were the ones who designed systems no one questioned. When the Panic of 1893 struck, the worst depression the nation had seen, unemployment soared past 20%, railroads failed again, banks shut doors. And yet, once more, consolidation followed collapse. The invisible architects adjusted their maps. They did not rebuild America as it had been. They rebuilt it stronger for themselves. Hale died in 1894, largely unknown, but the infrastructure he helped shape would carry American troops into 2 world wars. It would transport oil that fueled global dominance. It would bind a continent under economic gravity stronger than any constitution. And almost no one would remember his name. Because America does not only run on democracy, it runs on design, and design is often invisible.
The letter arrived in the winter of 1933, folded 3 times and sealed with a symbol Daniel had seen only once before, carved into a stone far older than the United States itself. It bore no return address, only a faint imprint of an eagle clutching 13 arrows. But beneath the eagle was something else, a serpent forming a circle, swallowing its own tail. Daniel Hale had seen that serpent once before, in the margins of a colonial ledger hidden in the archives near Boston, and the memory of it made his pulse slow and steady rather than quick. Fear did not serve a man like him. Curiosity did. Inside the letter was a single line. The vault beneath the river was opened in 1814. You were never meant to know. 1814, the year the British marched on Washington, D.C. and set fire to the young republic's capital during the War of 1812. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the maps pinned to his study wall. Maps of colonial trade routes, native confederacies, early banking charters, and the westward lines that cut across the continent after the Louisiana Purchase. He had always believed history's official version was a skeleton. The real story was the muscle and blood hidden underneath. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood on the frozen banks of the Potomac. The river moved slowly under gray skies, its surface broken by drifting sheets of ice. He carried a leather case containing copies of correspondences between officials who had served under James Madison. Most of the letters were mundane, requests for supplies, troop movements, diplomatic apologies, but one mentioned a transfer of secured assets hours before British forces reached the city. The assets were not listed. The location was described only as beneath the river, secured by design older than the Republic. Design older than the Republic. Daniel had traced those words backward through footnotes and forgotten memoirs until he found a reference to a private society operating quietly in the years after the Revolution. Its rumored founder had once served under George Washington and later advised Thomas Jefferson. The society had no official name, but in scattered journals it was called the Custodians. He followed the river downstream to a section where colonial maps showed a supply depot that no longer existed. Local fishermen spoke of an old tunnel that flooded every spring, its entrance hidden behind collapsed stone. Daniel waited until dusk, then climbed down the embankment with a lantern and a coil of rope. The entrance was there, half swallowed by mud and vines. The air inside smelled of iron and ancient water. The tunnel sloped downward at a steady angle, lined with bricks that did not match early American construction. They were thicker, denser, more uniform. He ran his fingers along the mortar and realized it had been reinforced decades after its original build. Someone had maintained this place long after the British burned the capital. The passage opened into a chamber supported by stone pillars. At its center stood a locked iron chest bolted into the floor. The chest bore the same serpent symbol from the letter. Daniel knelt and examined the lock. It was not British, it was not American. It resembled designs used in European vaults during the late 1700s, sophisticated, layered, almost ceremonial. Inside the chest were documents wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture for more than a century. Daniel carried them back to his study in Boston and began to read. The first document was dated 1790, the year Alexander Hamilton proposed the creation of the first Bank of the United States. It described concerns that foreign creditors, particularly from Britain and France, might attempt to influence the fragile American economy. But the document went further. It claimed that a separate reserve, independent of the national treasury, had been established to ensure the continuity of the republic should Washington fall. A shadow treasury. The next set of papers referenced coded transfers during the War of 1812. Gold and critical documents had been moved from government buildings days before the British arrived. Official history recorded the burning of public records and the desperate evacuation of artifacts like Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Washington. But these papers suggested something far larger had been hidden: financial instruments, treaties with frontier leaders, and a charter signed in secret. Daniel read through the night. The charter outlined a contingency plan drafted shortly after the Constitutional Convention. If the capital were captured or the federal government incapacitated, a parallel structure would activate, funded by reserves kept hidden from public accounting. The custodians would oversee it. Their authority derived not from election, but from appointment by a closed council of former officers of the Continental Army. Daniel set the papers down and stared at the fire in his hearth. If this was true, the Republic had never relied solely on visible institutions. Beneath the Senate, beneath the presidency, even beneath the Supreme Court, there had been another mechanism, one designed for survival at any cost. He searched the remaining documents for names. Several signatures appeared repeatedly. One belonged to a man who later served in quiet advisory roles under multiple administrations. Another matched correspondence archived during the era of westward expansion. A third name shocked him. It appeared in a letter dated 1862, during the height of the American Civil War. The letter implied that the custodians had intervened financially to prevent foreign powers from recognizing the Confederacy. They had leveraged private credit lines in Europe to stabilize Union bonds. Official historians credited diplomatic skill and battlefield momentum, but here was evidence of a hidden financial maneuver that may have tipped the balance. Daniel leaned back, heart pounding. If this parallel structure had operated during the Civil War, had it also acted during later crises? The Panic of 1873, the Great Depression, the World Wars? He pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1917, the year the United States entered World War I. An anonymous donor had quietly purchased massive quantities of Liberty bonds before public subscription opened, stabilizing prices. The anonymous donor's identity had never been confirmed. The serpent symbol appeared again in the margin of a banker's private diary in 1929, weeks before the stock market crash. The diary mentioned a reserve shield that would prevent total collapse. Daniel remembered the emergency measures taken during the early days of the Depression, interventions that were attributed to executive orders and congressional acts. But perhaps some actions had begun before the public ever knew there was danger. The more Daniel read, the more a pattern emerged. Every time the Republic faced existential threat, invasion, civil war, financial collapse, a silent force adjusted the scales, not to control the nation, but to ensure its survival. But survival came at a price. Tucked at the bottom of the chest was the final document, a ledger of obligations. Funds deployed during crises were tracked meticulously, with notes indicating future influence as collateral. Industrial magnates, railroad barons, newspaper publishers, politicians. Each name was marked with a symbol indicating debt repaid or debt outstanding. Daniel realized the truth was not heroic or sinister alone, it was complicated. The custodians had preserved the United States at critical moments, but they had also accumulated leverage, invisible leverage. He closed the ledger and understood why the letter had warned him he was never meant to know. Knowledge of the custodians could destabilize public faith. If Americans believed their democracy had an unseen guardian or overseer, trust might fracture. Outside his window, Boston's harbor lights flickered against the dark Atlantic. Ships moved silently, carrying goods across the same waters that had once brought revolution and empire. Daniel felt the weight of centuries pressing against the present. He knew part one of the story had only scratched the surface. The vault beneath the river was proof of concept, but somewhere, perhaps in another city, perhaps beneath another monument, the custodians might still operate. And if they still operated, then the greatest untold chapter of American history was not buried in the past. It was unfolding in the present. By the spring of 1934, Daniel Hale no longer believed he was researching history. He believed history was watching him. The serpent symbol had begun appearing where it should not exist, penciled faintly inside a library book margin, etched so lightly into a courthouse cornerstone in Philadelphia that only angled light revealed it, stamped in red wax on an envelope delivered to his boarding house without a postmark. Each time it appeared, it carried no threat, no instruction, only a reminder. You are reading what was never meant to be read. Daniel's investigation led him back to the earliest references to the custodians. He traveled south to Mount Vernon, walking the grounds once owned by George Washington. Washington's official letters spoke endlessly of unity, debt, foreign influence, and the fragility of the Republic. But in a lesser-known correspondence between former Continental officers, Daniel found something different: coded references to continuity and guardianship beyond tenure. It was not paranoia. The founders had feared collapse. They had seen republics fail before: Rome, the Dutch experiment, countless city-states swallowed by stronger empires. The American Constitution was bold, but even its architects knew parchment alone could not defend a nation from foreign money, internal fracture, or coordinated sabotage. The custodians, Daniel now believed, were born from that fear. In Philadelphia, where the Constitution had been debated in secrecy, Daniel found records of a private meeting held weeks after the convention concluded. Attendees included former military officers and financiers who had supported the revolution. No minutes survived. No official record acknowledged the gathering, but a hotel ledger confirmed their presence. The timing mattered. Just before the federal government moved to Washington, D.C., a series of land purchases occurred along strategic waterways, purchases made by shell entities that dissolved years later. The properties were never developed publicly. Some were described only as storage facilities. Daniel suspected at least one of them matched the vault he had discovered near the Potomac. As his research progressed into the 19th century, the pattern sharpened. During the American Civil War, private European banking houses hesitated to finance the Union cause. Yet suddenly, confidence shifted. Gold reserves stabilized, Union bonds regained credibility abroad. Official accounts credited diplomatic brilliance and battlefield victories, but Daniel had read the ledger. The custodians had leveraged quiet relationships forged decades earlier. But the Civil War documents revealed something more unsettling. A debate had erupted within the custodians themselves. Some members argued that survival alone was insufficient. They believed the organization should guide the nation's direction, not merely protect its existence. Others insisted their oath was limited: preserve the republic, interfere no further. The argument nearly fractured them. After the war, the custodians retreated deeper into obscurity. Daniel traced faint references through the Panic of 1873, through industrial consolidation, through westward expansion. In each crisis, liquidity appeared when catastrophe loomed. Railroad bankruptcies were absorbed quietly. Key infrastructure remained intact. Public explanations credited market corrections or bold entrepreneurs, but the serpent symbol flickered behind the curtain. Then came the 20th century. Daniel examined documents from 1916 and 1917 when the United States debated entering World War I. The custodians' internal memoranda, if authentic, revealed no desire for war, but they feared economic collapse if Europe defaulted on American loans. A stabilization fund was activated weeks before the public announcement of entry. When Congress voted, the financial groundwork had already been secured. It was the same during the early days of the Great Depression. Before the emergency banking measures of Franklin Roosevelt became public policy, private capital had quietly reinforced key institutions to prevent cascading failures. Daniel now understood why certain banks reopened quickly while others vanished. The custodians did not save everyone. They saved the system. One night in late autumn, Daniel returned to the Potomac vault. He had begun to suspect that the chest he found was only a fragment. The chamber walls bore faint seams in the stone. With careful measurement, he identified a hollow section behind the western pillar. After hours of chiseling, a smaller compartment opened. Inside was a single sealed envelope addressed not to him, but to the next witness. Daniel hesitated before breaking the wax. The letter was dated 1902. It acknowledged that discovery of the vault was inevitable. It described the custodians not as rulers, not as conspirators, but as custodial engineers of stability. They intervened only when probability models, primitive but meticulous, predicted systemic collapse within months. Most chilling was the final paragraph. If you read this, the Republic has endured longer than we projected. That endurance is not accidental. It is managed. Decide carefully whether the people are better served by certainty or by belief. Daniel sat in silence, the echo of dripping water filling the chamber. Managed endurance. He thought of the Revolution, of fragile debates in Philadelphia, of British flames in Washington, of brother fighting brother in the Civil War, of breadlines in the Depression. Each crisis felt chaotic, human, unscripted. Perhaps it had been. Perhaps the custodians did not dictate events. They merely prevented total collapse when human error threatened annihilation. The distinction mattered. Daniel returned to Boston with the final documents and spent weeks drafting his account. He wrote not as an accuser, but as a historian confronting complexity. He included copies of ledgers, property transfers, coded correspondence. He avoided sensationalism. He framed the custodians as an insurance mechanism, morally ambiguous, historically consequential. Then, on the night before he intended to publish, another envelope appeared beneath his door. No serpent, no wax seal, only a single typed sentence. Continuity now rests with you. There was no threat, only acknowledgement. Daniel understood then that the custodians had not tried to stop him. They had allowed him to see. Perhaps they needed a chronicler. Perhaps transparency, carefully measured, was the next evolution of guardianship. He burned the original ledger. He published a diluted version, enough to hint, not enough to destabilize. He left breadcrumbs for future researchers. He kept the most volatile evidence locked away, hidden where only a determined seeker might find it. Years later, as global tensions rose again and the world drifted toward another catastrophic conflict, Daniel watched financial markets steady themselves with uncanny precision. Emergency funds materialized before panic spread. Alliances held when they might have fractured. He no longer searched for the serpent symbol. He knew it was there. The untold history of the United States was not a tale of secret rulers pulling every string. It was the story of a republic so fragile at birth that some of its founders built a shadow scaffold beneath it, unseen beams reinforcing visible pillars. Democracy remained real, elections mattered, wars were fought by citizens, not ghosts. But beneath every public institution ran a quiet current, a reserve of influence, wealth, and contingency designed not to govern the nation, but to ensure it survived long enough to govern itself. Daniel Hale never revealed the full truth. He became, reluctantly, what the letter had named him, the next witness. And somewhere, beneath rivers, beneath monuments, beneath the foundations of cities Americans pass every day without a second glance, the custodian's work continued, not rewriting history, not controlling destiny, but guarding the thin line between collapse and continuity. That was the forgotten chapter. Not that America had been secretly ruled, but that at its most vulnerable moments, it had been silently steadied. And the greatest untold truth was this: the survival of a nation is rarely accidental. Sometimes it is engineered in the dark so that millions can live in the light.